Make it 5 years and counting for Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, staying put for now inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London after a local court refused to lift the arrest warrant against him. The statute of limitation has run out on Swedish sex assault charges against Assange, but UK authorities still want him for jumping bail and ducking into the embassy back in 2012. His attorneys worry more broadly whether the UK will want to extradite him to the US over the leak of classified documents. We're going to be asking our panel what's become of Julian Assange, what he represents. The now 46-year-old Australian native still portrays himself as a crusading journalist. His name, though, has become synonymous with the accusations of Russian meddling in the last U.S. presidential election, what with WikiLeaks publishing documents that damaged Hillary Clinton's run for president. What's become of Assange? What's become of WikiLeaks? What's become more broadly of whistleblowing? After Snowden, after the Panama and Paradise Papers, is the world really more transparent? How are we adopting to a world where it's all out there on the web? And does transparency really mean a fairer world? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Assange 5 years on, and we're pleased to welcome for this edition. She is Jennifer Robinson, the attorney representing Julian Assange, joins us from London. Thank you for being with us.
You're very welcome.
We also want to thank from Tallahassee, Florida, Republican strategist Rick Wilson. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Julian Assange has outlasted a Swedish arrest warrant, but the UK justice system is not done yet with him. He's going to have another day in court in a week's time to see if that charge of skipping bail can be dropped. Clément Bonnereau has more on what is a very long tale indeed.
To some, he's a cyber hero who exposed government abuses of power. To others, he's a tool of Russian intelligence, a criminal who undermines the security of the West. Julian Assange was born in Townsville, Australia in 1971. As a teenager, he showed an exceptional aptitude for computers. He cracked a number of secure systems, including those at NASA and the Pentagon, but was eventually caught, only escaping prison on the condition that he did not reoffend. Assange founded WikiLeaks in 2006, but the whistleblowing website did not make international headlines until 2010, when it published a series of leaks from Bradley Manning, a US Army intelligence analyst. Among these was a video of a US helicopter firing on Iraqi civilians, killing 12 people, including 2 Reuters journalists.
It's clear that it will shape an understanding of what the past 6 years of war has been like, and that the course of the war needs to change.
WikiLeaks has since disclosed hundreds of thousands of secret military files and diplomatic cables. Assange says total transparency is for the good of all people by making companies and governments accountable to the masses. The 46-year-old, however, has been criticised for receiving support from countries like Russia, Venezuela and Ecuador, which hardly live up to his ideal of transparency and freedom of speech. Some have gone as far as accusing Assange of being an instrument of the Kremlin. In the lead-up to the 2016 US election, WikiLeaks released thousands of emails from the Democratic National Committee, potentially damaging Hillary Clinton's campaign. Some US officials believe this was part of a Russian intelligence operation to disrupt the election and boost Donald Trump's presidential bid. Assange has also come out in support of Brexit, famously receiving Nigel Farage, a close ally of Donald Trump and a vocal advocate of closer links with Russia, at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's been hiding for over 5 years. It's not clear whether Assange has ever had direct ties to Russia, but his agenda and that of the Kremlin have often overlapped.
Let me begin with you, Jennifer Robinson, and just if you could update us, please, on what's going on legal-wise. Because on the one hand, the request to drop the extradition, the charges has been refused. But there's another court date next week. What will happen then?
Well, first, I need to correct some of the inaccuracies that were included in your package.
Sure.
He has never been charged. The reason the Swedish matter has been dropped is not because of the expiration of a limitation period. It's because after 6 long years of us offering to give his testimony, the Swedish prosecutor finally came to London and took his testimony and heard his side of the story and decided to drop the case. And that's a really important point because he has been under restrictions for more than 7 years. I walked him into a police station over 7 years ago in relation to a Swedish arrest warrant for questioning in circumstances when we were offering his testimony. And after 6 years, she finally did so and dropped the case. So that's important. The warrant that was upheld today was in relation to that old case, which now no longer exists. She decided to uphold the basis of that warrant. What there was further argument on today was whether it is in the public interest to charge him for a bail offence. Now, he has breached the terms of his bail conditions by seeking protection in the Ecuadorian embassy, or arguably has. He does have a potential defence to that he had a reasonable reason not to attend, which is the risk of extradition to the United States. We submitted today and put evidence before her the public interest aspect of this, which is he's already spent more time than he would ever be found guilty of if he was to be charged with a bail offence and found guilty. And it's really not in the interest of justice to pursue this any further. Now, we just now have to wait for another week, and we're expecting her decision next week. So that's where we...
Oh, dear. The cut off there, the line with Jennifer Robinson in London. We'll try to reconnect. I want to welcome, by the way, Douglas Herbert, who joins us here on set, our France 24's very own. Doug, before we got cut off with Jennifer Robinson, she was explaining how, that's going to... they're hoping this could all come to a head next week.
Yeah, they're hoping it could come to a head next week. I just want to mention one thing. I mean, it's important, the broader framework here, keeping in mind that although he failed today in court in the sense that he lost the ruling was against him, there's no certainty that he would have just sort of skipped out down those steps of the Ecuadorian embassy onto the streets of London, a free man, willingly right away had the
because just to remind viewers, there's three issues, right? There's the charges out of Sweden,
which
you heard her answer
dropped.
about.
Yes,
there's skipping bail.
Exactly.
And then this will be the question when we get the line back with Jennifer Robinson, which is this fear that his defense has that if he walks out of the embassy, he could be extradited to the United States.
This is the sort of overarching concern, if you will, or the greatest uncertainty surrounds the whole matter of the secret grand jury process in the U.S., whether or not there's any intention now or in the near future, because nothing has been clearly signaled or telegraphed with respect to getting an indictment or an extradition request from the U.S. authorities, exactly the type of thing that Julian Assange has been legitimately concerned by, because the fear being if he were to be extradited to the United States, he could possibly face, if he were convicted, very long prison terms.
And so we have Jennifer Robinson back on the line. Apologies for those technical issues. Jennifer, if all goes well for you next week and the skipping bail charges are dropped and he's able to walk out a free man from the Ecuadorian embassy, will he do so or will he remain there out of fear of extradition to the United States?
Well, it remains a great concern for us, and I'm sorry I missed part of the broadcast, but in the past year we're having very clear signals from the Trump administration, including from the U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who said that it was a priority to prosecute Julian Assange. We've also heard from the director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, saying that WikiLeaks is a hostile non-state intelligence agency, that the CIA is going to take them down, and that Julian Assange should not benefit from First Amendment rights. Now, for any American, let alone for anyone internationally, to hear that the head director of the CIA is trying to remove First Amendment protections for a publishing organisation is a grave threat to free speech, and it ought to be resisted. So we are very concerned that the potential indictment that is waiting to be unsealed if he walks out of the embassy will carry a significantly long jail prison sentence, and I don't think that he ought to have to face that risk.
Well, Jennifer Robinson, let me ask you on that point. Let me ask you a simple question.
Sure.
He's recently been granted Ecuadorian citizenship. Does he have a diplomatic passport?
That's a matter for Ecuador to answer. And really, that's why Ecuador has requested mediation with the United Kingdom. That's because for many years they've been seeking an assurance to protect him from extradition. They've granted him asylum, and the UK has refused to acknowledge that protection or to grant him safe passage to Ecuador.
Because if he has a diplomatic passport, normally he shouldn't be extradited.
He ought not be extradited, but the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK has said that they rejected any presentation of diplomatic credentials, and they refused to confirm or deny whether or not there is an extradition request. In those circumstances, we cannot be confident that if he walks out of the embassy, he will not be arrested and face extradition proceedings to the United States. And it is a real concern, and one that I think all of us and anyone who cares about free speech ought to be worried about.
It's Doug Herbert here in the studio. Forgive me, maybe a slightly naive question. I'm still a little confused. If, in fact, the skipping bail charges, if he's able to clear through the UK courts on this, who would be actually doing the arresting if he were to walk onto the streets of London? Presumably, it would not be within the purview of UK police or UK authorities. Who would be actually arresting him?
If extradition requests made by the United States will be acted upon by the British authorities, which means if there is a valid extradition request from the United States, it will be communicated to the police or through the Crown Prosecution Service who executes extradition requests, and the police would be instructed to arrest him and take him into custody for the purposes of extraditing him to the United States. So the UK authorities would act as the agent of the United States.
All right. Sounds like he's not leaving the embassy anytime soon, from what you're saying. Rick Wilson, let me ask you to react to something Jennifer Robinson said a short while ago, which is that the treason charges that the U.S. Justice Department wants to bring up, that they're tantamount to flouting the First Amendment, free speech in the United States. Your reaction to that?
Well, Julian Assange is not a citizen of the United States, and he therefore has no rights under the First Amendment or the U.S. Constitution in this particular matter. The second thing is Julian Assange, by the assessment of the entire U.S. intelligence community, is an asset of the Russian government, is a Soviet, or excuse me, I'm old, I still say Soviet sometimes, is an asset of Russian intelligence services, specifically the GRU, and he is engaged in things that have been detrimental to U.S. national security time and time again, engaging in leaks using material extracted from U.S. systems and U.S. persons by the Russians, and then using him as the conduit. So folks will pardon me if I don't have a whole lot of pity for Julian Assange if there are charges that have been brought in a constituted grand jury in the United States on things that, and it wouldn't be treason, it would probably be espionage. But there are certain aspects of his behavior that the U.S. government has a strong interest in seeking justice and sending a message to this guy.
Rick Wilson, a quick question, Doug Herbert here. How assured are you that Donald Trump himself would be willing to aggressively pursue an extradition request? I mean, you know as well as I, you heard Donald Trump during the campaign saying he loves WikiLeaks.
I'm not at all.
No, what I'm saying is, do you foresee a possibility, a prospect that Donald Trump could put himself at odds with his own government on this issue?
Absolutely, and the government right now has been telling him, and his senior intelligence officials have been telling him that this is going to be a very red line with the U.S. intelligence community, because they have all assessed, including Trump's own CIA director, that WikiLeaks is an adjunct of the Russian intelligence services, and that Assange is an asset of the Russian intelligence services. And so, but Donald Trump and Sean Hannity and his folks at Fox News love Julian Assange, love WikiLeaks. They look at them as allies, and they look at him as one of the proximate causes for Trump being able to defeat Hillary Clinton, because Julian Assange, in coordination with Trump's team and with Fox News, strategically leaked a lot of these things against Mrs. Clinton at exactly the right moment in the campaign.
Jennifer Robinson, is the context of what happened in the U.S. presidential election campaign something that weighs on the case and something that weighs on the defense?
Well, first of all, I have to set a number of things straight which have just been mentioned. Julian Assange will be entitled to First Amendment protections in the US, and non-US citizens who face justice within the US are equally able to assert constitutional rights. It is incredibly worrying that someone would assert that the First Amendment would not apply to criminal proceedings that were brought in the United States. First and foremost, that must apply. Otherwise, I'm really concerned about what's happening in the United States. Second, he is no asset of the Russian authorities. It has not been proven that he received anything directly from Russia, and in fact he said he didn't, and nor has any evidence been shown to that fact. The New York Times said that they would have published the DNC material. So in terms of publishing material in the public interest, that is true. That information was verifiably correct and showed corruption within the Democratic Party. Now, we can have our debate about what impact it had upon the US election, but from the principled position of what the First Amendment permits and the publishing position of material in the public interest, which the New York Times also would have published, I think this neo-McCarthyist kind of debate that's happening in the US is at the detriment of constitutional protections and the rule of law.
All right, there's no firm proof, but there are a lot of clues or questions. We're going to talk about them when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.
What do you want from your news website? France24.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website. Inside the Americas, presented by Jeannie Godula.
From North America to the southern tip of Patagonia, join us for a look at the latest political, economic, cultural and social news from the Americas.
Inside the Americas on France 24 and France24.com.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyze how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories that Laura Cillier is watching for you in the newsroom, keeping a close eye on Wall Street, one day after the New York Stock Exchange's biggest single-day drop. European markets, again, for the sixth-day running, closed in the red. It's been a seesaw ride today for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The ANC postpones Thursday's State of the Nation speech by Jacob Zuma to Parliament. This on the eve of a meeting by the ruling party to decide whether to oust South Africa's president. Emmanuel Macron in Corsica to mark the 20th anniversary of the assassination of the state superintendent of that island. The French president firmly rules out an amnesty for the killers of Claude Rignac. This on the eve of Macron's meeting with the island's nationalist leaders. And a little bit of a delay, but SpaceX will be taking off later. Falcon Heavy, the world's most powerful rocket, Elon Musk's latest brainchild, going on a test run with on board one of Musk's very own Tesla Roadsters. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Julian Assange holed up for more than 5 years in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and it will be a little while longer at least. A court in London will be reconvening next week to hear arguments regarding the WikiLeaks founder. With us to talk about it from London, his attorney, Jennifer Robinson. Welcome back as well to Republican strategist Rick Smith, who joins us from Florida's capital, Tallahassee, and here in the studio, France 24's very own Douglas Herbert. 5 years in the embassy means, by the way, that there's a new president in Ecuador. Lenin Moreno has fallen out with his more left-wing predecessor, Rafael Correa. Here he is celebrating his win in a referendum that reimposes term limits for Ecuadorian presidents. Moreno told reporters recently Assange was, quote, an inherited problem that had created more than a nuisance for his government. He said, we hope to have a positive result in the short term. What's your reaction to those words, Jennifer Robinson?
Of course, this matter has gone on for a long time, and Ecuador has come under significant political pressure for its decision and principal decision to provide protection to Julian Assange and to stand up against the potential US extradition request. So that, understandably, it's causing problems for Ecuador, and we understand that. Ecuador has continued to stand by him and has sought mediation, and we very much support those efforts.
When he says that we hope to have a positive result in the short term, since he is not singing from the same hymn sheet as his leftist predecessor, do you think he could cut a deal with the UK government at some point?
I certainly hope so, and in Ecuador's interest, in the interest of protecting asylum status, and in the interest of protecting First Amendment protections and free speech, I do certainly hope that they'll mediate a solution that will protect him from US extradition.
Rick Wilson, your thoughts. What happens to Julian Assange if he goes to Ecuador? Is he forgotten about, or will he continue to be an important figure?
Well, given the scope of some of the things that he has released that have compromised U.S. intelligence programs, sources, and methods in American military forces and intelligence services abroad, the memory will be long. It will be he will never spend a quiet night, in my view, even if he's in Ecuador. I think he's going to have significant. He should be a guy who sleeps with one eye open for the rest of his life, because the animus toward him and what he has done on behalf of the Russians and the Russian intelligence services in order to harm American interests and American personnel, that's something they don't readily forget.
So who would go after him if he has, since Ecuador and the U.S. don't have an extradition treaty? What are you suggesting?
Well, he's going to travel someday.
All right.
And unless he wants to be in another, look, Ecuador is a perfectly lovely country, but when you can't travel and you can't move, you can't do the things you want to be doing in your life, it's going to be a much different circumstance. I know he's lived in a broom closet for 5 years, but switching one prison for another is not helpful. And at some point, a U.S. government's going to say to Ecuador, here's the criteria by which we're going to continue to have good diplomatic relations. Would you like that or not?
All right, and that brings us.
A lot of the political climate.
I was going to say that brings us to
a lot of the political climate in Ecuador is shifting.
The political climate in Ecuador is shifting. It brings us to what you were saying before the break about his alleged ties to Russia. Now, last week, Roger Stone, one of the central figures in the Trump-Russia investigation, was in London for a talk before a conservative group, and he told the Daily Beast that he'd gone to the Ecuadorian embassy. The Republican political consultant and D.C. lobbyist said he dropped off a card but didn't actually see Assange. The Daily Beast reporting the conversation with Roger Stone this way. In the bar, after giving a speech in support of Brexit, Stone chatted with a small group of people to whom he insisted Assange was no agent of Russia, but simply a journalist. Tell us, first of all, Rick Smith, what you make of Roger Stone, and what do you make of that visit to the Ecuadorian embassy?
Well, look, Roger is a showboater, but Roger's got his own difficulties right now, because Roger was one of the conduits for the Grucifer emails, which were also a product of Russian intelligence, and I'm sure Roger's attorneys were not happy with that particular visit. That probably wasn't the wisest move.
Why would he go to the Ecuadorian embassy?
Roger is also part of this. I couldn't speak for Roger on that matter at all. But he's a showboat, and he's a guy who's got a great eye for news and a great eye for putting himself in the news. So I'm going to presume that's the reason. But in the case of Roger, he's also among this group of folks who was part of using Russian intelligence in the 2016 election to give Donald Trump a political advantage. And he has admitted that he took the information from Grucifer, who has been identified by the American intelligence services once again as somebody who's a pass-through and a conduit for Russian intelligence, Russian hacking through the GRU's Cozy Bear program. And so this is the sort of fruit of the poison tree. All these guys who say, oh, look at these great emails about Hillary, they allied over the fact that these emails came from a hostile foreign intelligence service seeking to disrupt the U.S. democracy, disrupt U.S. elections.
Jennifer Robinson, your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, anybody can walk up to the embassy and hand a card over, and you wouldn't, the amount of people that do that every day, you'd be surprised by. So that he turned up at the embassy to try to make join and didn't is the story. The fact is he didn't. And that's all I really have to say about it.
All right, at this point in time, I'd like to welcome Vaughan Smith, a friend of Assange, a journalist back in 2010 who helped him post bail in the UK. Thank you for joining us from Norwich, England.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I'm late.
That's okay. We're discussing these alleged links between Assange and Russia. What are your thoughts when people connect the dots between Julian Assange and those tied to the Russia investigation, between Julian Assange and Nigel Farage, for the UKIP leader who sees Vladimir Putin in a positive light?
Well, I mean, I've known Julian personally for many years. He stayed with me for 13 months. And I've kept in touch with him and I visited him. And I've asked these questions, obviously, because I'm curious too. But there's nothing he said that has made me doubt him on this. I just don't think it's true. And it's very easy to sort of apparently join the dots. But I think one needs a bit of evidence. I don't see it. I don't think that Julian is the sort of person, he's very independently minded as a person. He does things for his own motivations. I don't think he's in the pocket of anybody. I think he genuinely believes that actually he does what he does in the public interest. And, if that is perceived to concur with what we think is in, the interests of another state, then I think that I don't think we should necessarily leap to a conclusion that they're linked at all.
Rick Wilson?
Well, look, I think you look at the totality of what the U.S. intelligence community has gathered about Mr. Assange's sources and methods, and against the things that he has leaked that have come directly from as end product from Russian military and Russian intelligence services. And you can't just paper it over by saying, oh, he's a do-gooder, oh, he's a watchdog, he's a reformer. It just doesn't pass muster. I mean, it's one of those quite obvious questions that people have asked over the years. Why is it that WikiLeaks seems to produce metric tons of American intelligence product and occasionally touches on some Russian things that are already in the public domain? It's an interesting moment because we are the only focus of a lot of the WikiLeaks things that have gone directly to endanger American intelligence sources and methods and American troops in the field. And those have been leaked by Assange with the full foreknowledge that they would do that. And those things came from, in large measure, a lot of that boosting came from the Russians.
Vaughan Smith?
No, I don't agree with that. I think you're putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with a very much larger number than 4. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the information that Assange has put into the public domain, which was provided to him by whistleblowers, may have been embarrassing to powerful people in America and elsewhere. But if what Julian does is exactly what it says on the tin, and he's been pretty consistent with that actually. Effectively, he set up a letterbox online, and a whistleblower can put information into that, and if he believes it is true, he will put it out, and he declares that he will put it out to the greatest extent that he can. If there's nothing in there, if there's nothing in there, he can't put it out. So
but that kind of method has evolved since then. Since that huge data dump of U.S. diplomatic cables. Times have changed when it comes to whistleblowing. We saw Edward Snowden be a lot more careful and selective in what was handed over to journalists, not directly to the public. It wasn't made public as such. It was handed over to journalists that he trusted. Vaughan Smith, do you think that Julian Assange should perhaps revise his methods?
I think actually that is a very interesting question, and you know, while I don't think that he's in the pocket of anybody and that he genuinely believes in what he's doing is in the public interest, you know, it doesn't mean I agree with everything. I mean, I'm a journalist. I subscribe to what I think is a common view in journalism, that source protection is essential. But actually, I don't believe that Julian Assange doesn't necessarily believe that. I think source protection has been very challenging, and I've argued with him about it, and many people have. But I think you need to appreciate that there's a sort of balance sheet on these things. Julian Assange and what he does is a product of the internet age, and it's a product also of the fact that mainstream journalists don't look after their sources well enough these days, and have arguably, Julian believes, and I believe too, become far too close to power. What Julian has done is provided a great deal of information in an environment where most of the newspapers in my country are very opinionated, very political, and actually don't necessarily print the truth. What he's done is he's delivered something. Nobody's ever caught him out for publishing something that isn't true.
They've caught him out for perhaps being irresponsible by putting out everything, and as a result of putting out everything, you put some people's lives in danger.
Well, OK, but there's been no report that I've read that anybody's life has been put into danger. I have heard that people have been seriously inconvenienced and maybe had to leave a country. But this is the point I said. I said balance sheet. I don't think you can simply find a single fault in what he's done without looking at the wider public interest. Life just isn't like that. There's a real public interest. I meet journalists every day from all over the world that are using this information as the basis and source material for their stories. If you stand back far enough from this, you surely conclude that you know, there aren't that many problems in this world that can't be better resolved or somehow eased by a better public understanding. I'm afraid the mainstream media and governments, who are absolutely stuffed full of PR, you know, budgets and things like that, and they're just putting all this information out that simply isn't true. We need some truth, and I take a view that that truth adds to the public understanding and therefore promotes resolution. If one doesn't like necessarily a bit of information that comes out, I do think we need to resort to that wider view.
But of course, Douglas Herbert, the question is raw data the truth? Because we've seen
raw is unmediated data is what we're talking about.
Yeah, because we've
since
seen not just Edward Snowden, but we've also seen with the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers,
right,
whistleblowing that was vetted by this consortium of international journalists, LuxLeaks as well, where they painstakingly sifted through it and decided what gets published and what doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously journalists have come under a lot of bashing. You could say some of it justified, some of it not, but there is a reason that journalists do exist, and there is a case to be made for synthesizing information and not shielding information from the public, but putting information in a context in which it's mediated information. It's not an argument against transparency, just the opposite. I will mention that in the case on which Julian Assange and WikiLeaks really rose to fame or notoriety, depending on where you come at the issue, the Iraq and the U.S. military personnel's secret activities in Iraq and Afghanistan back in 2010, when all of that was released, there were in fact consequences, and there were task forces actually set up by the U.S. Defense Department in order to try to find, identify, seek out individuals who might have been identified and named in those documents in order to try to protect them, essentially, against the possible fallout and consequences. So there are real-life consequences to this information. Now, that is not to weigh in whether or not that means you should or should not release it, but it's not to ignore the fact that unmediated information, there are consequences for it. National security doesn't exist for nothing. There are reasons for it, and at times it's not just some sort of Hollywood thriller terminology, national security. You invoke it in order to keep information from people. There sometimes could be real legitimate lives at risk and reasons for not wanting certain individuals, not wanting certain people to be made known to the public. And obviously there is a knee-jerk sort of reflexive instinct. You say the words freedom of information, you say the words transparency, and the sort of populist impulse is, let's have it all. Let's see everything. Let the public be the mediators. There could be an inherent danger sometimes in that, because when you have too much information unmediated, out of context, and with no explanation or understanding of it, it could sometimes have real backlash and negative consequences.
Yeah, Rick Wilson, when you think, going beyond just WikiLeaks, when you look at how whistleblowing has evolved in the 5.5 years in which Julian Assange has been inside of that Ecuadorian embassy, is the world a better place today?
I think transparency and whistleblowing absolutely have a role in an accountability function in democracy, and that we need them in a whole set of areas, including, frankly, in military and intelligence matters. But inside the military and the intelligence services, they've built systems for whistleblowing. They're not perfect. They're not always efficient, but they're there. And those systems are designed to preserve sources and methods and to safeguard U.S. military and intelligence forces. Now, on the financial sector, I think that whistleblowing is also, such as the Panama Papers, been of enormous value. But again, those things have been vetted, cleaned up. They try to take the innocent parties out of the reporting. Your redaction has a powerful role in protecting innocent people who might get smeared in some of these things. And so I think that whistleblowing is a vital function in a democracy. I'm not arguing against it at all. What I'm concerned about with Mr. Assange is that his whistleblowing is very frequently the work product of Russian intelligence services and the work product of people who are inimical to the United States in every way. And I am always struck by the oddity that Mr. Assange's vast ability to gain leaks around the world rarely touches on anything in Russia. It's a miracle. I just find it so fascinating that he never seems to come up with, coverage of Putin's systematic oppression of his political opponents or anything like that, or Russian intelligence services spying and oppressing their own people. Those things seem to be somehow of little interest to Mr. Assange.
All right.
No, I'm sorry. I just don't think you understand the mechanism by which he operates. He's not like a journalist who goes and finds stories. They require to be put in his Dropbox. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest what you've suggested, that he's somehow in the pocket of the Russians. We don't know that. And I do feel that the whole redaction.
There's evidence to suggest it.
No, there's not. There's not. There's not at all. Just because the Russians apparently may have had it. I mean, and also this whole idea, it's very trusting that you allow the security services to police themselves. And I'm not sure that's what the public wants. I'm not sure that's in the public interest at all.
The issue of how whistleblowing.
No, I'm not saying they should entirely police themselves.
You're saying you're relying on internal whistleblowing mechanisms. Hang on. You said that you thought that there were plenty of internal whistleblowing mechanisms, but clearly Snowden didn't think so.
I said that they have mechanisms internally. I didn't say they were always adequate. In fact, I said they were not always adequate. But what I am telling you is that there is a large consensus among the U.S. intelligence services across the 17 major agencies, the DNI, and including Donald Trump's own CIA director, that WikiLeaks is an active adjunct and participant with Russian intelligence services. And we have a whole host of information on why we believe that in the U.S., including a lot of communications intelligence that shows the data flow from the Russians to Julian Assange. This is not something that we treat, we're not just making it up off the top of our heads. We're not just, coming up with a reason that we don't like Julian Assange. This is a large volume of intelligence material in this country over a long period of time that shows that Mr. Assange and WikiLeaks are directly involved with Russian intelligence. It's not something that you can just hand wave away.
Right.
No, I'm sorry, I don't accept that. I don't accept that as evidence. You say it, but an observation is that he's somebody who has upset a lot of people, in the American administration and American and powerful people in America. I don't believe there's evidence at all. I think you pose that, but you can't demonstrate it. Now, I realise it's quite hard to expect you to do this on this program, but I don't accept that at all.
But he has espoused causes that are the same as that of the Kremlin, Brexit, Catalonian independence.
Yes.
He seems to be following the Russian line.
Yes. No, I accept that perception is easy to adopt, and I'm not saying I disagree with that. It's not, incidentally, a line that I subscribe to. But that can be coincidental. I mean, so do rather a lot of British voters, so do rather a lot of Catalonian voters, and rather a lot of Americans. So, I don't think you can put two and two together. Look, there is a question. We don't actually know is the truth. I think we should be concerned about it. I think asking questions is perfectly valid. But I do feel that it's not appropriate to dominate a conversation by labelling his motives. I'm probably I saw him in December, and I asked him these questions. I don't believe myself to be particularly gullible, but I left satisfied. I'm not without complete doubts, but I'm satisfied. My issue with it is much more. I would prefer this to be somehow less politically geared. I'm fed up in journalism with it being so opinionated. I rather like the idea of a Dropbox putting information out. I can accept that it can only put out what it has, but I'm worried about the way that may be used to greatest effect, and I think that's an interesting one. But broadly, Julian has done what it says on the till. And please don't forget, Julian Assange is the product of a failure of journalism and a failure of these very means that you talked about for whistleblowers to come up. He's also a product, obviously, of the internet age and the great complexities of that.
All right, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, because the clock is running short. Vaughan Smith, thank you for joining us from Norwich in England. I want to thank Rick Wilson for being with us from Tallahassee, Florida. Douglas Herbert, stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So obviously a lot of comments on social media and on the news websites about this case. Many people following it, and of course lots of headlines on the fact that this was unsuccessful for Julian Assange in a blow to his freedom bid. So just to look at some of the comments on social media. This one is a little bit glib, perhaps. Meanwhile, outside the Ecuadorian embassy, police prepare a trap in case Julian Assange emerges secret documents. I don't think that one is likely to work. In any case, he hasn't left the embassy.
Yeah, we've seen that cat a lot all day.
That's right.
Because journalists have nothing to film, right? So.
With more of a following than the three of us combined on social media, for sure. And the cat should also walk free with Assange. So there have been some interesting elements coming up on that cat's social media, quite a politically minded cat. In any case, the free Assange and free Julian hashtags have also been chock-a-block with messages of support for Julian Assange and indeed for the whole enterprise of whistleblowing. Please let the man see sunshine and get fresh air. Julian Assange is a hero for bringing us the truth and suffering because of it. And indeed, Julian Assange himself sharing graphics, sharing opinion pieces from the Washington Post, etc., underlining all of his arguments for being freed 2 years since the UN ruled Assange is unlawfully and arbitrarily detained by the UK authorities. 5.5 years with no access to sunlight. And there have been articles as well going up in the press giving his doctor's point of view about the risks of being kept indoors away from sunlight, not getting access to proper health care, the psychological effects of indefinite detention. So all of that is getting a lot of airing and a lot of sharing online. Certainly his point of view is getting quite the echo. And of course, for the broader debate, it is, as you were discussing here during the show, it is an echo online as well. Are these whistleblowers? Are they manipulators? And really, I think it just simply comes down to what your point of view is. There are lots of tweets online of this nature, because I was trying to see leaker or whistleblower, terrorist or freedom fighter, traitor or patriot. It kind of comes down to where you position yourself on the whole, where you draw that red line.
And some say that this kind of discussion is sort of an institutionalization of conspiracy theories, because both sides can believe what they want.
You see in it and you interpret, right, exactly whatever you want in it. And with Julian Assange, I guess Edward Snowden as well is another prime example. Although they're unlike as characters and temperament, they do have a similar defenders and detractors.
Absolutely,
staunch.
Absolutely, and both arguments have merits when you get into it. I guess it depends on the individual case. Interesting to see now that there are, first of all, iamwikileaks.org. You can donate to contribute to the legal fund of Julian Assange if you want. There's now a new European NGO in favour of, actually this isn't the same NGO, but another one has been launched in the last couple of weeks, looking for full protection and full rights for whistleblowers in every European country. So I guess this is a battle that is not over yet.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel and thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.